Well, thank you very much, everybody, first of all, for coming out tonight. I know everybody has a lot of stuff going on in Tucson, so I really appreciate it that everybody came here for this. I think this is going to be a great tradition at Mineral City in the future. And please tell me if I'm not speaking loud enough. If you can't hear me, just let me know and I can speak up a little bit. So I know a lot of you in the room. My name's Philip Persson. I work for Collector's Edge Minerals up in Golden, Colorado. And I'm going to speak a little bit tonight about the Sweet Home Mine, which I think many of you are familiar with. And we're going to focus on a new project we have at the Sweet Home Mine called the Detroit City Portal. So a little bit of history and location of the Sweet Home Mine. I know many of you already know about the Sweet Home Mine and where it is, but for those of you who don't, basically the Detroit City Portal is a new mineral specimen mining project at the Sweet Home Mine property. So we're about 130 kilometers west of Denver in the Rocky Mountain region of the United States. So if you look in the map here, I think most of you know where Colorado is. This is a little bit of an inset view here, and I'll have another map in a second. But basically, we're in the central region here of Colorado, about a 2-hour drive from Denver. So the Detroit City Tunnel is about 70 meters above the former Sweet Home Mine Tunnel. And it's on the side of a mountain called Mount Bross. This is a 14er, so it's above 14,000 feet in elevation, about 4,321 meters. And the purpose of this project, as you could guess, is to search for more world-class crystals of rhodochrosite, which have really become famous with collectors around the world. So a little more history and a good location photo here of where the Detroit City Portal is. So in this photo here, you can see this road here. This is Kite Lake Road, so you can see we're in an alpine valley kind of setting here. You can see that the Sweet Home Portal is basically right down by the road here. So this is the historic Sweet Home Portal that yielded all the amazing rhodochrosite crystals that everybody has seen. You can see that the Detroit City Portal is up a little higher on the hillside here. So we're right at the timberline here. And this is Mount Bross. This is the 14er up here. This ridge continues over and connects to a couple other 14er peaks. So this is kind of the central part of the Rocky Mountain region here in Colorado. So the decision to pursue specimen mining at Detroit City obviously was due to the success that Collector's Edge had at the Sweet Home Mine in the first project. I think most of you have probably seen rhodochrosite from the Sweet Home Mine. It operated from 1991 to 2004, but it also had produced great specimens before that. So after the mine was closed in 2004, no mineral specimen mining took place up until about the fall of 2018, and we'll talk about that a little more in detail. But before we talk about the Detroit City project, which began in 2016, I figured we would summarize the Sweet Home project a little bit for those of you who may not know the details of that. So the Sweet Home deposit actually has a pretty long history. It was discovered back in 1873 during Colorado's gold rush period, and many settlers moved primarily from the eastern U.S. to the Rocky Mountains in this region. The Sweet Home Mine operated from 1873 to the early 1960s as a small underground, mostly silver, but there was also some lead, zinc, and copper. But it was never very profitable. As far as I know, the owners never really turned a profit off of the ore production. However, world-class rhodochrosite crystals actually have been noted as far back as 1876. So if you look in some historic European collections, for example, sometimes you see very fine rhodochrosite specimens that are labeled Leadville or just Colorado. And some of these are actually from the Sweet Home Mine. So there's actually a fairly long history of mineral specimen production from this mine. A major pocket was found in 1926. This was sold to two Colorado mineral dealers, August Pondorf and a guy named Hart in Colorado Springs, for $900. And this was a lot of money back in 1926. So, these things have always had value. And even going back to the 1920s, they've really been coveted by collectors. This is kind of a neat photo here. This is the old Sweet Home Mine sign. I think this is from the probably 1910, 1920 era. You can see a sign here going up to some of the other mines. And this is the portal. I believe this is actually back in the World War II era. This is what the Sweet Home Mine portal looked like at that time. So Collector's Edge was not the first group of people to operate the Sweet Home Mine for specimens. There was a couple other people who went in with some limited success, most notably in the 60s, so about 1965 to 1975. And there were some significant specimens that were discovered in this kind of earlier mining period. The most notable is the so-called Alma Queen Rhodochrosite, which you can see over here. This is in the Houston Museum of Nature and Science, a fairly famous piece. So a little bit more location and history of the Sweet Home before we get to some nice specimen photos. So in 1991, the Sweet Home Mine was leased to Collectors Edge Minerals, and as many of you know, that's owned by Brian and Catherine Lees. And they had the idea of trying to reopen this as a working mine only for mineral specimens, which was something that was somewhat new at that time. So they got money together from a group of investors, and the Sweet Home Mine was modernized for the first time. And the new mining focused on exploring the extension of some of these veins and mineralized structures for rhodochrosite. Initial mining didn't discover much rhodochrosite, but in October of 1991, a perfect 5-centimeter crystal was discovered in a small pocket, and you can see that in this photo here, very fine crystal. And this convinced the investors to put in some more money, and the rest is kind of history. So starting in 1992, major rhodochrosite pockets were discovered, and many famous specimens were found, including the Alma King, the Alma Rose, lots of other pieces that you've seen. And you know, it's important to note that even though the Sweet Home was very successful, there were often fairly long periods between significant discoveries. So, you know, sometimes months or even going up to almost a year period between major pockets. So this is really the nature of specimen mining. And I think anybody who's involved in specimen mining can attest to that. It's often this kind of feast or famine situation that having a good understanding of geology was really critical, and also having patience between these kind of discoveries. So just a handful of iconic Sweet Home Mine Rhodochrosites. We just talked about the Alma Queen here on the left. This is about a 12-centimeter crystal. This has a fairly well-known history. It was in the Swoboda collection and went out, or Bancroft collection, and then went to the Houston Museum and Dave Wilbur, among other people. The Alma King here in the center, this is in the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. This crystal is about 15 centimeters, huge crystal on matrix. This was its pocket mate, which originally went along with the Alma King to the Rice Museum up in Portland, Oregon. This is also a very large specimen out of the rainbow pocket. Possibly my favorite is the so-called snow cone over here. This is at the MIM Museum in Beirut right now. Really incredible quality. That's also a very large crystal, and that came from the Good Luck pocket. So fast forward to fall 2004. This was basically when the original Sweet Home Mine was sealed off and reclaimed. And there were a number of reasons for closing the mine. I think the biggest was that essentially the additional work necessary to find a new target zone for rhodochrosite pockets would have jeopardized a lot of the profits that had been made up until that point. So the project had been successful, it was profitable, that the veins and the structures pinched out and were not very well mineralized, and the additional work would have really been a fairly high-risk situation. So the decision was made to close the Sweet Home Mine, mainly due, like I said, to a lack of rhodochrosite targets. You can see here, this is one last view out of the portal here when they were sealing off the portal. You can see an excavator here filling this back in, and right now this is what you see. So you would have no idea that there was a tunnel right here that produced some of the world's best rhodochrosite crystals. So moving forward to the Detroit City project. So first of all, a lot of you probably wonder where the Detroit City name came from. So the Sweet Home Mine is actually part of a claim block, and that claim block consists of about a dozen claims. And that claim block is called the Detroit City Claim Block. So it's actually a historic name. It goes back to the late 19th century. I'm not sure of the Detroit connection. Brian Lees grew up in the Detroit area, and he loves cars. So I have a feeling that he was pleased with that name as well. So maybe not entirely coincidence. But that's where the name comes from. And essentially what led up to the decision to go back in at Detroit City was a fair bit of research that happened between about 2004 and 2015. And this was primarily done by a gentleman named Dean Missantoni. He's our geologist, lives up in Alma. And he, along with some people actually over in Europe, Volker Luters and several other researchers, had a fairly robust set of geochemical data, a lot of specimen data, a lot of structural data, surface mapping. Some of these veins actually outcrop on the surface, so we were able to project some of these structures into the subsurface using this data from the surface. And that all kind of led up to the decision to go back in at the Detroit City portal. 2014 to 2015, we got a little more serious and started doing some project design, cost estimates, government permitting. So, in terms of scope and expense and everything else, this is pretty similar to what you would do in, say, the junior mineral exploration industry. If you're a junior mining company, you just got listed on the TSX, and you're trying to develop a small mineral property. This is kind of a similar scale, you could say, just we're mining for specimens instead of looking for ore. So 2016 to late 2018, we started to build and install the different elements of the mining infrastructure, and we dug about 140 meters of haulage tunnel to intersect the mineralized veins. It's advancing forward here. There we go. So 2005 to 2013, as I was saying, this was mainly focused on kind of taking all the data we had, the scientific data, and some of the research that had happened during the Sweet Home period and consolidating that and trying to make a plan for how we were going to target what we believed was the remaining part of the Sweet Home deposit. So this gentleman here on the left here, Mr. Dean Misantoni, some of you may know him. He is really the expert on the geology of this area. He's worked and lived up there for many years. And he has done a huge amount of field mapping and a lot of sampling and geochemical analyses. So a lot of his work is what went into kind of developing this model. We did a 3D model, geologic model, trying to understand the distribution of these veins and how the different host rocks may affect the rhodochrosite pocket distribution. Several papers were published on the Sweet Home deposit as well during this period, most notably by Volker Luters in 2008, and then Dean Misantoni was involved in a paper also in 2008. So I know you probably all want to see beautiful rock photos at this point, and I promise they're coming, but I'm a geologist and I'm going to bore you with some geology before we get there. So consider this your penance until we get to the pretty rock photos. I won't make it too long. But the geology of the Sweet Home deposit is actually pretty cool. We're in an area here called the Colorado Mineral Belt. So this is the state of Colorado, and you can see we have this very nice kind of southwest to northeast trending lineament here. And this is about 500 kilometers long. It's about 25 to 50 kilometers wide, and it's known as the Colorado Mineral Belt. And as far as what this is, there's a lot of different theories out there. But essentially what we know is that this was created during the Laramide orogeny. So this was the major orogenic mountain building period that created what we see today in the Rocky Mountains. This was about 30 to 60 million years ago. And we think that this is exploiting a pre-existing weakness in the crust that actually goes back to the Proterozoic, so back to the actual accretion of North America back in the Proterozoic. But I won't get too much into the weeds there. Essentially, what you need to know is that we're in the mineralized part of Colorado, and more specifically, we are in the central region right here near the town of Alma. So here is the location of the Sweet Home deposit. What you're seeing in this map here is a series of younger sedimentary rocks, mostly limestones and dolomites. Those are these kind of blue and purple units. And then down here, this gray tan, this is the Precambrian basement, which in Colorado is about 1.7 billion years old. So at the Sweet Home deposit, our veins are actually hosted in the Precambrian rocks, but the veins themselves are much younger. So we've done some dating work, and we found that the Sweet Home deposit formed about 26 million years ago, and we think it's related to hydrothermal fluids from a very large porphyry deposit nearby called the Climax Mine. And some of you may have heard of the Climax Mine. It's a very large open pit mine. They're mining molybdenum, and the date of that deposit is almost identical to Sweet Home. And in terms of spatial relationship, it's only about 8 kilometers away. So it's a kind of natural connection between the two. And for those of you who study mineral deposits, you probably know about the sort of porphyry epithermal connection. I think this is a really nice example of that kind of relationship. So a little bit more geology. I promise this is the last geology slide. So essentially, this is a cross-section view of the previous map that we looked at. So if you look over here, you can see this is kind of a hypothetical. We have the climax porphyry right here. So this would be a Laramide age porphyry, this red. This is an intrusion. And up here, we have this kind of telescoping to the surface. This is the climax mine. You can see we have some normal faults here, which are very typical in the Rocky Mountains. And then over here, closer to the Sweet Home mine, we have similar normal faults. And we have some mineralized veins that are kind of coming up from the apex, the upper region of this granite pluton, this porphyry. And you can see this gray here. These are our Precambrian host rocks. And then there's some surface topography. And these are some of the younger Paleozoic rocks here. So the Sweet Home deposit itself is a series of nearly vertical epithermal type veins. These are dominantly silver, lead in terms of metallurgy, but they also have a little bit of zinc and copper. Typically they're fairly narrow, so 10 to 30 centimeters across is a typical vein width. So some of these are quite small. Again, these are hosted in Precambrian rocks. These are metasedimentary rocks, what we call the Idaho Springs group. There's a little bit of granodiorite as well. And through some of the research that was done by Volker Lüders, we believe that the fluids which form rhodochrosite and the other minerals we see at the Sweet Home mine actually have two components in their genesis. So they have a magmatic component, and this is related to these deep magmas, these porphyry magmas over here. But they also have a meteoric component, which is basically downward circulating groundwater. So we see a little bit of influence from both. And in terms of our fluid inclusion data, we see that basically gem quality rhodochrosite formed at a temperature somewhere between 280 and 310 degrees Celsius. So we've been able to constrain that with doing some fluid inclusion work. So I lied. There's one more geology slide, but I'm going to be quick on this. Couldn't help myself, sorry. So this is a plan view looking at the portal, and this is actually useful to look at really quick before we dive into some of the stuff we found, because it kind of puts in context what we've done. So if you look at this right here, this is our portal, and essentially this is our adit that goes in here. It's a horizontal tunnel, so we go back here about 600 feet, and here is our main vein that we're targeting right here. So this is our main target right now. We're stoping upward on that, so we've gone in horizontally here, and then we've intersected the vein. You can see that we've gone laterally on the vein a bit, and then we've gone up vertically. So we're doing a mining technique called stoping, and we're basically going up ladders. It's kind of like if you played chutes and ladders as a kid. That's kind of what we're doing here, looking for rhodochrosite. All this gray here, these are our Precambrian rocks. This PCGN, this is mostly granitic gneiss. This green here, this is a younger monzonite porphyry dike. So, you know, even out here, fairly far away from the climax porphyry, we see some dikes of the porphyry, and some of them have molybdenite, actually. So recently we've seen a fair amount of molybdenite, and it actually is making us wonder if maybe there's a molybdenite-bearing intrusion, maybe a porphyry that's closer to us than we think, maybe actually kind of behind us in the mountain. So that's kind of another topic. But like I was saying, the vein is typically narrow, 5 to 20 centimeters, and there are some other faults as well. So this red here, this is our main vein that we're focusing mining on, but we've got some other structures, this watercourse fault. So some of you may have heard of the watercourse structure in the Sweet Home mine that produced many fantastic pockets, including some of the really famous ones. And essentially, this tunnel right here is about 200 vertical feet, 180 vertical feet or so, above the uppermost workings of the Sweet Home mine, just to kind of put it in context. So we're going to kind of walk through a little chronology now of what's happened at the Detroit City mine, kind of what our mining process has been. So 2016, we started with the road. We had to kind of improve the road to get up to the portal. And then we put in some electric, and we installed a mine office. And Graham Sutton, who I imagine some of you know, is truly a jack of all trades and is extremely good at doing stuff like this and figuring out how to make cool things like mine buildings that are made from shipping containers and cool stuff like that. So we've got an awesome shipping container office here on site, which is quite nice, especially when it's cold and snowy out. You can see our road here. We're putting in some electrical lines. And then we also started putting in the portal. So this is our initial portal installation here. You can see we're on a big talus slope. So luckily this is on the south side of the valley, so it actually doesn't get quite as much snow as the north-facing side. This is all south-facing. But you know, we did want to put in this structure to protect ourselves from all that talus that you see there, so that doesn't come down on top of the portal. So moving forward to 2017, we actually started to mine into the mountains. So we drifted about 35 meters of tunnel in 2017, and we started advancing towards the target zone. We also had to do some stabilization in the initial part of the portal. This is very common in underground mines because the rock quality is not so great close to the surface. So you see George here is one of our miners, and all this kind of mesh around him. This is very typical in an underground mine. This is basically to support any loose rock that might be, and there's rock bolts that go in a couple meters there as well. We then covered that with shotcrete here to kind of stabilize that zone. And here's what our portal looks like over there. It's kind of not so different than the roll-up doors here, actually. And just like the roll-up doors here, there are good rocks behind it. So also in 2017, we created some mine ventilation infrastructure. We put a tunnel up to the surface. It's very important to have a secondary escape way from a mine, so that's kind of what this structure is here too. It kind of looks like a telephone booth on the side of the mountain, and this is so we can get out if something were to happen and we couldn't get out through the primary portal. So we also installed our ventilation room here. This is a vent fan here, and pretty much every mine today is required to have a pretty robust ventilation system for safety and for having good air. We're lucky and we have pretty good air everywhere in the mine, but we did have to put in this ventilation system. So moving forward to 2018, we mined an additional about 115 meters of haulage tunnel, and most importantly, we actually intersected the mineralized veins, including the main vein, in 2018. We paved the mine portal with concrete, we installed a compressed air system, and we installed a water recycling system too. So all of these are kind of infrastructure things that go into having a modern functional mine. And you can see Dean here with our LHD, load haul dump. This is a critical piece of equipment in getting rock out of the mine and getting stuff into the mine. Here's our fearless leader over here, Brian, with a couple guests up at the mine. We've done quite a few tours. In fact, some of you sitting in this room may have even been on a tour, and we look forward to doing some more tours this coming year. So also in 2018, we started to mine upward. So this is where we actually started to encounter some mineralized pockets and encounter the kind of vein that we were hoping to see. So we started to develop what we call ore chutes in the area of the mineralized vein, and this is part of the upward stoping process. We also mined along the vein on the first level, that's the adit level, about 70 meters, and we did find several small pockets containing rhodochrosite specimens. So you can see here is Graham, and George is drilling here. So this is a fairly old school mine. You know, most modern mines use rubber tire equipment, and they're fairly automated and mechanized. We did use rubber tire equipment for our initial adit work, but when we're actually up in the stope, we're doing jackleg drilling. And this is how people mined, 80 years ago or 100 years ago even. It really hasn't changed that much. So it's a very specialized skill set. We're lucky to have several miners who are really good at this type of specialized mining and enjoy that type of work. And we did find some rhodochrosite, and I'll get more into the specifics of that soon. But here's a kind of a typical photo of what the vein looks like. So you can see there's typically some zonation. We have rhodochrosite in the core of the vein here. We have sulfides, principally tetrahedrite, that are on the edges of the vein. And then we have some pyrite that's kind of on the outside, this kind of selvage of the vein here. And what you're seeing on the side here is highly altered host rocks. So this is primarily biotite schist, some granodiorite. But all these metapolitic, these host rocks, have been very seriously altered in this area. There's sericite alteration, there's pyrite, secondary pyrite. And here is a nice rhodo that I'm holding right after it came out of the ground. That's on a light there backlighting it. So this is what you hope for. So now I'm going to kind of walk through some of the pockets here a little bit sequentially and some of the stuff we found since we've started. So the first pocket was in kind of the first half of 2018. I think it was early summer 2018. And that was actually on the adit level. So you can see here in this schematic, I know it's a little hard to see, but this would be the portal, and here is our crosscut, and then this would be the vertical development of the stope going up. So our first pocket was actually just off of our access tunnel there. And this pocket, unfortunately, did not have any rhodochrosite, but it did have some nice purple fluorite. We found quite a bit of this purple fluorite on quartz. And we also found some really nice sulfides. So this is a big plate of tetrahedrite crystals. Some of these actually are up to 3-4 centimeters, which is fairly large for Sweet Home tetrahedrite. And there were some other sulfides as well, galena crystals, chalcopyrite, possibly some bornite. So no rhodo, unfortunately, but still good to see a pocket pretty early on. So we advanced the horizontal development on the adit level a little bit over to the left, kind of in our left crosscut. And we encountered 3 pockets pretty close together. So the first of these pockets was 1801, and then we found 1802, 3, and 4 in a relatively small area. 1802 was kind of weird. Here's a specimen from 1802. It did contain rhodo, but they were kind of flattened pinkish crystals with quartz. And there was actually quite a bit of apatite with this as well. Small, gemmy apatite crystals up to about 1 centimeter. This rhodo habit, we were actually joking with Graham that we drilled so far into the mountain, we actually went through to the Wutong mine in China because the habit looks just like the rhodo from the Wutong mine. So good to see rhodo, not exactly what we wanted to see initially, but we were still happy to see rhodo. So that was from the 1802 pocket. Moving forward a little bit, we hit the 1803 pocket, and this was a small pocket, but this is probably the second best pocket in terms of quality of what we found so far. And this was cool too because our miners, Chris and Aaron, there's actually 2 Chris's, Cheese and the other Chris. All miners have nicknames, in case you didn't know. They got to actually practice some of the specimen mining skills in these early pockets, and they've been doing a really good job. And some of you may know when you're doing this kind of specimen mining, whether it's in a pegmatite or you're in a narrow vein like us, having tools like a hydraulic splitter and a diamond chainsaw are really invaluable. So you can see here is a photo of the pocket in situ with some rhodochrosite crystals. This is a very narrow opening. This opening is only like 5 centimeters. Some of the crystals are almost touching the crystals on the other wall. So the only way to really get these out is to drill a close series of holes like this and insert what's called a hydraulic splitter. So basically this is a feather and wedge mechanism. It's air powered, and it forces the rock apart, but in a kind of a non-explosive way. So you break up the rock, and then eventually when you're able to bring in a diamond chainsaw, this is Cheese here with the chainsaw, you can actually saw plates out. So here's Cheese with a big plate containing a nice rhodochrosite crystal on it that he's sawed off the wall, and there's the same piece after it was trimmed up there on that tetrahedrite matrix. So kind of cool to see the process of how these come out of the ground. So some of those same pieces cleaned up. We had some really beautiful combinations of rhodochrosite with fluorite. Unfortunately, this pocket was fairly small, but our best piece from that pocket was on the cover of Lapis. Some of you may have seen this earlier in 2019. Really beautiful combination with a bright purple dodecahedral fluorite that's on that rhodochrosite. And this is another very showy piece from that pocket. And there were actually some of different styles too. So there was this kind of not quite so gemmy red rhodochrosite on tetrahedrite. And then this piece was kind of cool as well. This piece, you can see, has nice cherry red rhodo, and then there's little fluorites on there that are actually color zoned. So they're cubic crystals, and they're very strongly color zoned. So that was kind of cool to see these 2 very different habits of fluorite. These purple dodecs or cube octahedrons, and then these color zone cubes in the same pocket. A couple more pieces from 1803. Here on the right, this is a pretty big plate. This is about 30 centimeters of rhodochrosite crystals with some of those color zone purple fluorites. This is kind of a cool piece. So you have some nice rhodo crystals here, and all these little crystals you see here, some of them are quartz, most of them are actually apatite. So you can kind of see the prismatic habit of some of these crystals. There's actually quite a bit of apatite in that pocket. And I want to pick the brain of John Rackavan, aka Mr. Apatite, and try to get an idea of, why are we seeing so much apatite in some of these pockets? I think this is kind of interesting. Oops. So that was kind of something different from that pocket. So moving on to 1804, this was also fairly close to the 1803 and 1802 pockets. This pocket, again, was a little bit different. These 3 pockets were over an area that was only about 4 meters, 5 meters at the most, but all these pockets were quite different from each other. So on the left, you can see an example of a rhodocrystal. That's about a 5 centimeter crystal that actually has fluorite up over it, which is kind of cool. Kind of a coating of almost like druzy fluorite. We also had some combinations with calcite. So this is actually quite unusual to get. They're not the prettiest calcites in the world, but despite having a ton of rhodochrosite, we don't have that much calcite. And this is kind of a cute piece with this little fluorite here or this little rhodochrosite that's on the calcite. And there were some other pieces that had the more typical kind of Sweet Home habit, more rhombohedral crystals as well. So moving ahead to 1805, this was a pocket that I got to collect most of, and that was really a treat. Getting in and collecting these pockets, it's a lot of work, it's exhausting, you're running the splitter all day, You're up at 11,400 feet. It's cold, but it is the most fun thing in the world. And I highly recommend it to anybody. It's really, really, really fun. So 1805 was different in that it was actually on our first vertical sub-level above the adit level. So we basically mined upward. You can see these ladders here in this cartoon. And we punched a couple holes in the ceiling, and then we started creating a sort of sub-level above the adit level. And this is part of our upward stoping process. We also created some ore passes here. This is where we can push broken rock down to the adit level to haul it out. So the 1805 pocket was on the right side, relatively close to this manway here. And this was a relatively large pocket, produced some fairly large plates of rhodochrosite on typical quartz. We call it needle quartz, these kind of thin quartz crystals. This is a fairly large plate. This is about 30 centimeters across. So good sized rhodo there. That's about 5-6 centimeters. And some cute smaller pieces too. This is about an 8 centimeter piece with some tetrahedrite and that sort of typical Sweet Home Rhodochrosite on it. So some more pieces from the 1805 pocket. We had some really nice associations with tetrahedrite. So tetrahedrite's the typical ore mineral that contains your silver and some copper and lead. And it's also typically the matrix for the good rhodochrosite crystals, both at Detroit City and at the Sweet Home Mine. So on the left here is a nice miniature. This is about a 5 centimeter piece. And some of these tetrahedrites even had a little bit of iridescence, which is kind of cool, associated with the rhodochrosite. This is kind of a nice combo. You've got the tetrahedrite, and then you've got some rhodochrosite and some fluorite on top of that. So basically all different combinations of these three species throughout the mine. And another nice matrix example here on some of the tetrahedrite. So a few more photos moving forward to 2019. So typically we mine for about 8 months out of the year, and it really depends on what kind of winter we're having, how bad the snow is. We are an underground mine, so in theory we could go all year, but anybody who's been to the Rocky Mountains in the winter knows that the weather can be pretty snowy and pretty nasty in the winter. And in 2018, we mined actually right up until about Christmas, and kept going a little bit later than we would have otherwise because we were actually finding some nice pockets up until the end of the season. But you can see here it's looking pretty snowy. For those of you who skied at Breckenridge is right over the hill, and we probably get even more snow than Breck does up here, so we get quite a bit of snow. Plowing the road is definitely a job. George, who's one of our miners, is typically out here with the snow plow, and plowing the snow is no joke. You can talk to Graham about that. These snow banks are 5-10 feet. Sometimes they get even higher if the wind is blowing. A day like this, zero visibility, the wind is blowing, it's not so fun to be at the surface. So we go as long as we can. But mining in the mountains of Colorado in the winter is no joke. So eventually though, the sun came out and the snow melted, and we moved forward to 2019. So this past year, we started mining right about the middle of April. So we had a fairly snowy winter in 2018, 2019, and got up there about middle of April. Still quite a bit of snow on the ground. This photo is taken in July, so you can see a lot less snow. This is kind of a cool drone shot here, actually. So you can see in this photo, you've got our access road coming up here from the main road. So Sweet Home Portal's over here. Access road is coming up here, and here's our portal area. So you've got our portal going in right there into the mountain. Our little shipping container office is over here, and you can see there were a bunch of visitors there that day, and some of our mining equipment. So overall, pretty small operation. There are some historic prospects in this area, so you can see this is actually a small dump here from some minor workings that happened mainly back in the late 1900s. These workings did not go very far underground, but basically they were exploring the same kind of mineralized veins that we are. So we are not the first people to mine in this area. We're the first people to go back and intersect the main Sweet Home vein, but we're not the first people to poke around here historically. And then here's our little escapeway structure up here. And you can see we're really right at the tree line here. Their trees are starting to get pretty thin. This portal elevation here is about 11,300. And for reference, this ridge, this is all above 13,500. So, above 4,000 meters. This is pretty high up here. So 2019, I think this really illustrates one of the fundamental truths of specimen mining. And I know some of you in the audience who do specimen mining yourself are probably nodding now. All of this area here, no pockets discovered. So this is a lot of rock. This is essentially, we found 4 or 5 great pockets in 2018 on the first level and this second level. These are 3 levels where we really didn't find any pockets. So, you know, this is the nature of specimen mining. The vein is fairly heterogeneous. There are areas where it's very well mineralized, and there's reasons for that I can go into if you want, that it's a combination of structure and geochemistry and fluid flow and other things. But sometimes you move a fair bit of rock and you don't find pockets. So that's kind of what happened here. But luckily, in the summer of 2019, we hit 2 really nice pockets. And this was great timing because we debuted the material at the 2019 Denver show. So pocket 2019-01 had some really nice color. This is a fairly large crystal. This is about 4 or 5 centimeter crystal. And again, on the black tetrahedrite, which is kind of a classic combination. And some of the crystals from this pocket were actually quite large as well. So here's a couple more pieces from the 2019-01 pocket. You can see nice cherry red color. The one on the right is probably a little closer to the true color. This has a little bit more pink. But again, this classic tetrahedrite matrix. And these are both pretty big. These are both 5 centimeter crystals. So good size. Unfortunately not quite the luster, the gem bright luster that we hope for, but still pretty good rhodochrosite. A couple more pieces from the 2019-01 pocket. This one is kind of fun here. This is kind of like it's not a twin, but it's 2 nicely intergrown crystals. And again, on this black tetrahedrite matrix. And these are both about 10, 12 centimeter specimens, so fairly large. So a couple more photos from 1901. Here's our mining crew on the left. Cheese, who's on the right here, is actually here in Tucson this year, helping out at wholesale. So if you see him and you have a Sweet Home Rhodochrosite or Detroit City one in your collection, say thank you, because these guys all bust their butt every single day trying to find these specimens. It's really hard work, and all 3 of them are super hard workers and really do a great job looking for these pockets. And we've got a couple other folks up there. Some of you might recognize this character on the right here. Mr. Joel Barch from Houston came up and visited us, and he brought some luck because this was the day that we pulled out a very large rhodochrosite. This is about a 12 centimeter rhomb. That's probably the biggest one we found so far. So we have found a handful of big ones too. So the last pocket I'm going to talk about is the 1902 pocket. And this was a little bit later in 2019, actually right before the Denver show. We were lucky to hit this before the Denver show. Again, this was a small pocket, but it produced some really nice combinations with fluorite. And this was very promising too, because this was the first pocket where we really saw rhodochrosite with high luster. So this is probably the best specimen from our project so far. This is about a 5.5 centimeter crystal. It's very lustrous, and it's got beautiful fluorite with it. And also, kind of interestingly, for those of you who know the Sweet Home, this is a barite crystal. So this is actually quite unusual for the deposit. This is not the prettiest barite in the world, but this is kind of a strange association. But we were very happy to hit this pocket with this one very nice piece and a handful of other ones. And this is right before the Denver show. So you can see here we've mined a number of levels. We've got this first level all the way up to the 5th level. We continued this past fall up to about the 7th level, I believe. So we have an additional, we've gone up in the stope about 120 feet, 130 feet. Don't quote me on the exact number, but we're about maybe 50% of where we're ultimately going to go in the stope development. So we still have a lot of rock to move. We still have a lot of prospective ground to cover in our rhodochrosite search in the stope. And we're also considering pursuing some secondary targets maybe as well. So a little bit of summary of what we've gone through here. So, this kind of puts it in perspective again, the work that goes into making a specimen mining project happen. 11 years of research, planning, and permitting kind of laid the groundwork for this project. 3 years of infrastructure design has led to what's now actually a fully functional specimen mine. And we've been basically doing focused specimen mining for about 9 months. And we've uncovered 7 pockets. So, there can always be more, but it's been a pretty good start. And we're seeing signs for potential for more pockets in the future for sure. And, we've really only just started. We wish that was 70 and not 7, but, we'll take what we can get. And we have a lot more ground to cover and a lot more rock to move. So stay tuned for the next update. And I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anybody have a question? Yep.
It seemed like you had the width of the stopes in the mine going just, or the length of the stopes, just a certain length. Is that just in your claim area? Why?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of it is the claim area, but a bigger part is that based on our projection of the main mineralized part of the vein from the Sweet Home, we believe that this particular part of the vein has the highest potential to produce pockets. So, it's more than just the entire width of the vein on the strike length being mineralized. There's some other factors, and when we looked up from the Sweet Home mine and projected the water course structure and some of these other structures upward, we saw a continuation kind of in that plane. So, we may go further laterally on either side, but right now we've kind of defined it to be the width that you saw. Anybody else? Yeah, Paul?
Do you know what the fluorescent orange material is?
Yes, great question. So with the advent of some of these new UV lights, some of you may have these convoy lights. There's other people that make them too. Sphalerite fluoresces very bright orange from the Toll Sweet Home deposit, and this is really cool. It's actually black iron-rich sphalerite, which you wouldn't expect to fluoresce, but it fluoresces a beautiful bright orange color. And I've even had people tell me that they've used it to distinguish Rhodo from Peru and other places that kind of look like Sweet Home from Sweet Home. So yeah, and it looks like he's got one right here. So maybe we can do a demonstration. But it's very.
Can't leave home without one.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. It's very characteristic for the whole Sweet Home deposit. This kind of fluorescence. Cool. Well, thanks everybody.
Quick question.
Oh, sure.
So, how close was the vein on line with where you had projected it to be? Was it offset at all?
It was within about 2 meters, I believe.
Okay.
So it was actually pretty good. There's a little bit of deviation, but the strike and the dip in general are actually fairly consistent.
Is this consistent with the fluorite rays coming from the Sweet Home?
Yes. So the fluorite rays is, I believe, a little closer to the watercourse structure. So it's a little closer to the surface, sort of, along our adit tunnel from where we are now. We may target that area as kind of a secondary target, depending on how the main stope development goes. But yeah, the fluorite rays also produce some great stuff in the Sweet Home mine. And it would be cool to kind of find the extension of that. Yep.
Do you do some kind of sonic testing to locate these cavities before you drill into them and ruin some 5-inch or 5 centimeter?
Yeah, so that's a good question. In the 90s, there was a little bit of work done with ground penetrating radar, trying to look at locating pockets that way. I don't know how successful it was. These mineralized pockets are very narrow. They're not like your muralitic, pegmatitic pocket that's a big round thing. These are very narrow. So there's not a great kind of signal to noise ratio when you do this. I think they had a little bit of success, but the best tool, honestly, that we found now is, it sounds a little crazy, but drilling right into the vein, into the strike of the vein when you think you're near a pocket, and actually hoping that you drill into a pocket. So you don't want to drill right into the 5-inch crystal. But splitting is really mechanically it's a lot of work, it's a lot of labor. So before you start splitting, you really want to see if you actually have something to split into, versus just the vein looks juicy, it's got lots of rhodo. So sometimes we'll actually drill right along the axis of the vein and then hope that maybe we intersect the pocket, or it looks like it's rhodo all the way through, and then we'll stop. We won't actually blast, and we'll use the splitter to get back there. Yep.
You mentioned the water treatment. With a community right below you, how did you end up working that out?
So there's quite a bit of rules in place, as you can imagine, as far as water treatment and what we're allowed to discharge from the mine. Luckily for us, the overall mine is actually very low in sulfides. Our sulfides are really contained to the vein, and even the vein itself, the sulfide distribution is fairly spotty. So, and it's also a very dry mine. We're lucky that it's an exceptionally dry mine. We don't typically have any water flowing out of the mine. The water that we do have coming out, we test, and also all our ore material is hauled off site, so we don't actually have ore on site that could potentially generate some acid drainage or acid discharge or anything. So, as far as underground mines go, this is really, I think, fairly low impact, low potential for any kind of water issue. And the town has been very cooperative. We work closely with the town for a long time. All right.
More questions?
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you very much.